It was a humid summer evening in Charleston, South Carolina. The quiet cobblestone streets, lined with magnolia trees, whispered in the soft breeze, carrying the salty scent of the nearby ocean. The historic town, known for its well-preserved antebellum architecture and a complex history deeply intertwined with the American South, was often a peaceful refuge for tourists and locals alike. But beneath the veneer of tranquility lay stories that Charleston's streets had witnessed, dark and disturbing tales that no one ever expected to emerge in the modern world. For Louis Marshall, a man who had dedicated his life to the pursuit of justice, it was just another evening after a long day in court. As one of the city's most respected judges, Louis had seen countless cases pass through his courtroom. His judgments were known to be fair and balanced, though often unpopular. He was particularly harsh on cases that involved racial discrimination or corruption, which earned him both praise and scrutiny in a city still grappling with the remnants of its historical divides. Tonight, he was on his way home after a long day presiding over a complex fraud case. The case involved a powerful local businessman, Roger Cartwright, accused of embezzling millions from a charity meant to aid struggling black communities in Charleston. Louis had been determined to see justice served, no matter the cost. Driving through the winding streets, Louis allowed himself a moment of relaxation, loosening his tie as he glanced at the darkening sky. His thoughts drifted to his wife, Emily, and their two children, Jack and Sophie. The warmth of his home beckoned him, but there was an unsettling feeling in his chest he couldn't quite shake. The streets, usually filled with tourists and locals alike, seemed unusually empty tonight, as though the city was holding its breath. As Louis pulled onto his street, his mind wandered back to the case. He had felt the weight of Cartwright's influence throughout the trial. Subtle pressures from powerful connections, veiled threats that never reached the light of day, but lingered like shadows in the corners of his mind. He had been through this before. High-profile cases often brought unwanted attention, but this one felt different. There was an edge to it, something more sinister that Louis couldn't ignore. The old ghosts of Charleston seemed to whisper warnings in the wind. Just as Louis approached the final turn toward his home, the familiar red and blue lights flickered in his rearview mirror. A deep sigh escaped his lips, and the knot of anxiety in his chest tightened. His speed was under the limit, and there was nothing unusual about his vehicle. He glanced in the mirror again, catching a glimpse of the police cruiser pulling up behind him. There was no reason for this stop. Louis had learned long ago that even when everything seemed right, situations like these could turn unpredictable. He was a black man driving alone at night in one of the wealthiest parts of Charleston. No matter his title, no matter his influence in the courtroom, it didn't change the fact that these stops never felt routine for men like him. Pulling over to the side, Louis remained calm, reaching for his wallet and pulling out his identification, both his driver's license and his judicial ID. His hands stayed visible on the steering wheel, a habit formed from years of hearing stories that started just like this and ended far worse. The night air was thick with anticipation, as if even the magnolia trees were watching with bated breath. In the mirror, Louis could see the officer stepping out of the car. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and white, his features barely visible under the brim of his hat. Something about the officer's slow, deliberate movements sent a shiver down Louis' spine. The tension in the air thickened as the officer approached. Louis kept his eyes forward, his thoughts racing. He knew he had done nothing wrong, but the weight of history was heavy on his shoulders. Encounters like this rarely turned out well for people who looked like him. He took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay calm, to stay composed. After all, he had been through this before. He was a man of the law. Surely that counted for something. As the officer reached the window, Louis lowered it smoothly, allowing the cool night air to sweep into the car. The officer's face was shadowed, but his presence was oppressive, filling the space with a subtle but unmistakable threat. Louis handed over his documents, his judicial ID prominently displayed alongside his driver's license. The officer didn't look at the ID immediately. Instead, his gaze lingered on Louis, scanning him as though he were assessing a suspect, not a judge. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating, before the officer finally glanced at the papers. A flicker of recognition passed over the officer's face, but it was quickly replaced with something else. Doubt? Disbelief? Whatever it wasn't respect. The officer looked back at Lewis, his gaze hard and questioning. There was no reason for this stop, and yet the officer's eyes spoke volumes. This wasn't about traffic laws anymore. Judge, huh? The officer's tone was flat, almost mocking. Luis knew that look, that tone. He had seen it countless times in his courtroom, heard it in the testimonies of black men who had stood before him, their lives torn apart by a system that treated them as less than. For a moment, Luis felt the familiar weight of prejudice settle over him. It was an insidious feeling, one he had hoped to leave behind when he became a judge, when he reached a position of authority. But tonight, that authority felt like a distant memory, as fragile as the quiet night air. The officer continued to stare at him, his gaze sharp and suspicious. Luis could feel the tide of the situation shifting. This was no longer about a routine stop. This was about something far more dangerous. The officer's silence, his posture, the slow way he took in every detail of Luis' appearance, it all pointed to the same unspoken assumption. Luis didn't belong here. Luis remained still, his breath steady, his mind racing through the possible outcomes. He had done nothing wrong. He had nothing to hide. But experience had taught him that none of that mattered when someone like him was seen as out of place. The officer's hand moved slowly toward his holster, a gesture that wasn't lost on Luis. He had seen that movement before, in courtrooms and in news stories that ended in tragedy. His heart began to race, the knot in his chest tightening as the officer took a step back, motioning for him to get out of the car. Luis hesitated for a moment, his mind flashing through all the cases, all the stories that began just like this. He had spent years fighting for justice, for equality, for the belief that the law was there to protect everyone. But standing on the side of that quiet Charleston street, with the weight of the officer's suspicion bearing down on him, he realized how fragile that belief truly was. As he stepped out of the car, the headlights from the cruiser illuminated him, casting long shadows on the pavement. The air was still, unnervingly quiet, as though the whole city had turned its eyes away from what was happening. Luis stood beside his car, his hands visible, his heart pounding in his chest. The officer's gaze never left him, sharp and unwavering. Luis could feel the eyes of Charleston on him now, not the city he loved, but the ghosts of its past, the old prejudices that never truly went away. The officer's words were blunt, questioning every part of Luis' identity, every detail of his life, as though his very existence was up for debate. The next moments blurred together. Luis felt his body tense as the officer moved closer, his hand still resting on his holster. This was not just a stop anymore. It was a confrontation, a battle for control, for power, for the truth of who belonged and who didn't. As the situation escalated, Luis knew that any wrong move, any misstep, could lead to something far worse. He had seen it happen before, too many times. He had presided over cases where a routine stop turned into a nightmare, where a man's life was forever changed because of the color of his skin. And now, standing in the harsh glare of the police lights, Luis understood just how easily that could become his reality. The story of Charleston was not just one of beauty and history. It was a city haunted by its past, by the deep-rooted divisions that still lingered beneath the surface. And tonight, those ghosts had come to life. The moments that followed Luis's exit from his car seemed to stretch into eternity. As he stood there, bathed in the glaring headlights of the police cruiser, the cold bite of fear took root in his chest. He had been in the legal system long enough to know that situations like this often unraveled without warning, spiraling into tragedy before anyone realized what had gone wrong. The officer was still eyeing him with thinly veiled suspicion, his hand resting too comfortably on his holster, and that was enough to make Luis hyper-aware of every move he made. He had been taught to stay calm in the face of confrontation, a skill he had honed through years of presiding over tense courtrooms. Yet, in this moment, that calm felt fragile, like a thin veneer barely concealing the rising tide of anxiety threatening to break through. He could feel the weight of every case he had ever judged pressing down on him. Every black man he had seen stand before him, their lives derailed by a single moment of misjudgment or misplaced suspicion. Now Louis found himself in the same position, vulnerable and powerless despite his status as a judge. The officer circled around the car, his gaze never softening. He asked for Louis' license and registration again, even though they had already been handed over. Louis felt a pang of frustration as the officer scrutinized the documents, flipping through them with an almost disdainful slowness. It was as though the mere existence of these credentials, proof of Louis' identity and status, was something the officer found difficult to accept. Louis could feel the air growing thicker with tension as the officer inspected his judicial identification card. The card had always been a symbol of pride for him, a tangible representation of the years of hard work, dedication, and sacrifices he had made to rise through the ranks of the legal system. But now, in the hands of this officer, it felt small and insignificant, as though the weight of his accomplishments meant nothing in this moment. "You're a judge?" The officer's tone was heavy with disbelief, as though he was questioning the very fabric of Louis' reality. The officer's disbelief was clear. He seemed almost amused by the idea that a black man standing before him could hold such a position of authority. Louis could feel the officer's skepticism radiating from him in waves, cutting through the quiet night air. It was a skepticism Louis had encountered many times before, but it had never felt so pointed, so personal. The words hung in the air, and Louis could feel his heart quicken. He remained composed, but there was a sharp sting in the officer's question. It wasn't just about the facts of the case or the stop anymore. It was about his identity, about whether he belonged in the role he had worked so hard to achieve. Louis had experienced prejudice in many forms throughout his life, but this cut deeper. This was a direct assault on everything he stood for, everything he had accomplished. Louis didn't respond immediately. He knew that anything he said now would be scrutinized, twisted into something it wasn't. Instead, he stood still, his hands still visible, his mind racing. He had heard countless stories from defendants in his courtroom, stories that began with a simple traffic stop and ended in tragedy. The common thread in all those stories was the tension, the unspoken fear that simmered beneath the surface of every encounter with law enforcement. In those moments, Louis had always tried to be empathetic, understanding the fear and frustration that came with being treated as less than human. But standing there now, with the officer's gaze boring into him, he understood that fear in a way he never had before. This was no longer an abstract concept or a distant narrative. It was his reality, and the weight of it was suffocating. The officer continued to inspect Louis' car, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he were searching for something, anything, that could justify his suspicion. Louis watched as the officer opened the car doors, peering inside as though expecting to find evidence of some hidden wrongdoing. The officer's actions felt more like an accusation than an inspection, and Louis could feel the familiar sting of injustice prickling at the back of his neck. There was nothing to find. Louis' car was immaculate, as it always was. The officer's search yielded nothing but the expected contents of a briefcase, a few files, and a coat neatly draped over the back seat. Yet, the officer lingered, as though unwilling to accept the fact that there was nothing out of place. Louis remained still, his mind churning with thoughts of how easily this situation could escalate. He had seen it happen before, routine stops turning into nightmares because of a misplaced word or gesture. He had presided over cases where black men were arrested, or worse, because they had failed to navigate the complex web of unspoken rules that governed interactions with the police. He had always tried to be fair, to understand both sides of the story, but in this moment, he realized just how fragile that fairness could be when faced with the harsh reality of racial prejudice. The officer finally stepped away from the car, but the tension didn't dissipate. If anything, it grew thicker, more palpable, as the officer returned to his patrol car, leaving Louis standing alone in the harsh glare of the headlights. The night had grown colder, and the silence that settled over the street was deafening. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Louis could see the officer in the patrol car, typing something into the onboard computer. He knew this was more than just a routine check. The officer was looking for something, anything, that could justify prolonging this encounter. Louis stood there, his muscles tense, his mind racing through all the possible outcomes. He had been through this before, but it had never felt so personal, so invasive. As the seconds ticked by, Louis became acutely aware of the vulnerability of his situation. He had always believed in the system, had worked within it for years, but tonight, standing on the side of the road with the weight of the officer's suspicion bearing down on him, that belief felt paper-thin. The law was supposed to protect him, but in this moment, it felt like a distant concept, something that applied to everyone else but him. The headlights of passing cars illuminated the scene briefly, but none of the drivers stopped. Louis could see the silhouettes of the passengers turning to look, curious about what was happening, but no one intervened. This was a quiet street in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where things like this weren't supposed to happen. But tonight, it was happening, and Louis was acutely aware of just how alone he was. The officer finally emerged from his patrol car, his expression unreadable as he walked back toward Louis. There was something in his posture that made Louis' heart skip a beat. A subtle shift, a tightening of the shoulders that suggested the situation was about to take a darker turn. Louis' mind raced. He had done nothing wrong, had complied with every request, had remained calm and composed. But none of that mattered now. He could feel the air growing heavier, the tension thickening with every passing second. The officer's next move would decide everything. Louis stood frozen as the officer approached, the weight of what was happening settling over him like a suffocating blanket. His heart raced, but his face remained impassive, a mask of calm that he had perfected over years of handling tense courtroom proceedings. However, this was different. The courtroom had always been a place where the law was clear, where his authority as a judge granted him a sense of control over the proceedings. But here, standing on the side of the road, he was just another black man caught in the crosshairs of a system designed to question his very existence. The officer stopped a few feet in front of him, the silence between them heavy with unspoken accusations. Louis had been through countless moments like this before, moments where the weight of his skin color seemed to outweigh everything else. His career, his achievements, his very humanity. But tonight, under the glare of the police lights, it felt more pronounced than ever. The streets of Charleston, once a place of history and pride for him, now felt hostile and unfamiliar. The officer's handcuffs gleamed under the headlights, a cold reminder of the power imbalance at play. Louis had seen those cuffs many times in his courtroom, placed on men who had committed crimes, on defendants he had ruled against. But now, seeing them so close, knowing they could be used on him, the world tilted. The injustice of the situation was thick in the air, as if the weight of history had come crashing down in a single moment. The officer's next words came, blunt and emotionless, but Louis didn't need to hear them to understand what was happening. He could already feel the narrative shifting, the same way it had shifted for so many men who had stood in his courtroom, who had been stopped on the street simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Except the only wrong here was the color of his skin. Louis could feel it now, the cold inevitability of what was about to unfold. There was no use in arguing, no use in stating the obvious. The law, the justice system, the badge, none of those things seemed to matter in this moment. The officer had already decided who Louis was. Despite the judicial identification card, despite the respect and authority Louis had earned, he was still reduced to a suspect. A black man standing alone on a dark street with no one around to intervene. Louis' chest tightened, a dull ache forming behind his ribs. The truth of the situation was sinking in, a painful, bitter truth he had tried to push aside his entire life. With slow, deliberate movements, the officer reached for Louis' arm. The touch was rough, not overly aggressive, but firm enough to send a message. You are not in control here. The message was clear, etched into every gesture, every motion. Louis knew this was no longer a simple traffic stop. It was an act of power, a reminder of who was really in charge. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into his wrists, a sensation that sent a jolt of anger and fear through him. He had been in the presence of handcuffs many times before, had seen them used in countless cases, but never had he imagined they would be placed on him. Not like this. Not under these circumstances. The cuffs were tight, uncomfortably so, and Louis winced as the officer locked them into place with a practiced snap. In the quiet of the night, the sound of the cuffs closing echoed louder than it should have, a final, jarring reminder that his status as a judge meant nothing in the face of this encounter. Louis felt his world narrow to the small, sharp circle of metal around his wrists, the weight of his position, his authority, crumbling under the crushing force of those cuffs. He had always believed in the system, in the law, but now that belief felt hollow, a cruel joke played at his expense. The officer led him toward the squad car, the lights flashing red and blue across the empty street, painting the cobblestones in harsh, violent colors. Louis could feel his breath coming faster, the cool night air doing little to calm the heat rising in his chest. The crowd of onlookers that had gathered at the edges of the scene felt distant, their faces blurred by the glare of the lights. He could hear murmurs, the soft ripple of disbelief and curiosity from those watching. But no one stepped forward. No one intervened. It was the helplessness that struck Louis the hardest. For so long, he had been the one in control, the one who decided the fates of others from behind the safety of his bench. Now, stripped of that authority, he was just another black man in handcuffs, paraded in front of a crowd that would never understand the full weight of what was happening. The power dynamics were painfully clear, and they had nothing to do with his credentials or his accomplishments. The officer opened the back door of the squad car and motioned for Louis to get in. There was no need for force. Louis complied without resistance. He knew how dangerous it could be to push back, to question, to assert his rights in a situation like this. Resistance, even the smallest amount, could turn deadly in an instant. He had seen it happen before. He had read about it, watched the footage, heard the stories from countless men who had stood where he stood now, their lives forever altered by a single moment of defiance. The inside of the squad car was small and claustrophobic, the heavy scent of stale air mixing with the sharp smell of metal. Louis sat in silence as the door slammed shut behind him, sealing him inside. The reality of the situation hit him like a wave. He had always thought of handcuffs as symbols of justice, tools used to detain the guilty. But now, feeling their cold grip on his skin, he realized how wrong he had been. For many, they were symbols of control, of subjugation, of a system that saw them not as individuals, but as threats to be neutralized. He thought of Emily and the kids, of how they would react when they found out what had happened. He thought of the people who had looked up to him, who had seen him as a symbol of justice and fairness. And now, here he was, a man in handcuffs, arrested without cause, treated like a criminal. The shame washed over him, a heavy weight that settled in his gut. The squad car pulled up to the station, its lights flashing against the gray stone building that housed the police department. Louis had been here before, but never like this. Never as a detainee. The officer parked the car and stepped out, his boots echoing loudly against the pavement as he walked around to open the door for Louis. With a firm grip on his arm, the officer guided Louis out of the car and toward the entrance of the station. The station was quiet, its fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow over the sterile hallways. The sound of the cuffs jangling against his wrists echoed off the walls, a constant reminder of his captivity. As they walked, Louis could feel the eyes of the officers on him, their expressions a mix of surprise and curiosity. Some recognized him. He could see the flicker of recognition in their eyes, but none of them intervened. No one questioned why a respected judge was being led through the station in handcuffs. The silence was deafening. Louis was taken to a small room, bare except for a metal bench and a table. The officer gestured for him to sit, then stepped out of the room, leaving Louis alone with his thoughts. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, a suffocating force that made it hard to breathe. The room felt cold, the walls closing in around him, and for the first time in his life, Louis felt truly helpless. This wasn't just about him. It was about the system, about the countless men and women who had been treated like this, who had been stripped of their dignity, their humanity, simply because of the color of their skin. Louis had always believed that he could make a difference, that he could change the system from the inside. But now, sitting alone in that cold, empty room, he wasn't so sure. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last. Louis's mind raced, replaying the events of the night over and over again, searching for something he could have done differently. But no matter how many times he went over it, the outcome was the same. There was nothing he could have done. The officer had made up his mind the moment he saw him. Louis had always believed in justice, in the fairness of the law. But now, that belief felt hollow, a distant memory of a time when he thought the system could be fair. Tonight, he had learned the hard truth. The system wasn't designed for men like him. Louis sat on the cold, hard bench, the metal pressing uncomfortably against his back. The stark walls of the small holding room seemed to close in on him, the sterile air heavy with the oppressive weight of the moment. The room was devoid of any warmth, just like the situation he found himself in. Stripped of his authority, his dignity, and his sense of control. The cuffs around his wrists were gone now, but their ghostly grip still lingered, a reminder of the cold metal that had bound him just moments ago. The silence in the room was deafening. Louis's mind swirled with thoughts he couldn't quiet, images flashing before him of past cases, of defendants sitting in his courtroom, cuffed and waiting just as he was now. For years he had believed in the system. He had trusted it to protect the innocent and bring justice to the guilty. But now, sitting alone in this small, sterile room, he couldn't help but question everything he had built his career upon. He thought of the countless cases he had presided over, young black men accused of crimes they may or may not have committed, each one standing before him with their fate hanging in the balance. He had always tried to be fair, to weigh the evidence impartially, to ensure that justice was served. But now, sitting on the other side of the system, he realized just how fragile that notion of justice was. How easily it could be twisted, how quickly the scales could tip against you, especially when your skin didn't match the color of power. The hours passed slowly, each tick of the clock feeling like a hammer blow against his chest. Louis's thoughts turned to his family. He imagined Emily at home, likely sitting by the phone, wondering why he hadn't come back yet. She would be worried, anxious, her mind racing with all the terrible possibilities. And then there were Jack and Sophie, their young faces flashing through his mind. How would they react when they found out what had happened? How could he explain to them that their father, a respected judge, had been treated like a criminal? The thought of their innocent eyes filled with confusion and fear weighed heavily on his heart. As the minutes dragged on, Louis felt a familiar anger begin to bubble up inside him. He had spent his entire career working within the system, believing that if you played by the rules, if you did everything right, you would be treated fairly. But tonight had shattered that belief. No matter what he had done, no matter how hard he had worked, the system had reduced him to nothing more than a black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. Suddenly, the door to the room creaked open, breaking the suffocating silence. An officer stepped inside, but it wasn't the one who had arrested him. This man was older, his face weathered and lined with years of experience. There was something different about him, a tension in his posture that suggested he knew exactly who Louis was and what had transpired. The officer glanced down at the file in his hand, then looked up at Louis, his brow furrowed in confusion. Without a word, the officer motioned for Louis to stand. He didn't explain the situation, didn't offer an apology or an explanation, just a silent acknowledgement that something had gone terribly wrong. Louis rose from the bench, his movements slow and deliberate, as though the weight of the night had physically drained him. He followed the officer through the dimly lit hallways of the station, his mind racing with thoughts of what would come next. The station was eerily quiet at this hour, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow over everything, making the shadows seem even darker. As they walked, Louis noticed the glances from other officers, their eyes flicking toward him with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. They knew who he was. He could see it in the way they shifted their weight, in the way their gazes lingered on him for just a second too long. But no one said a word. The officer led Louis to the front of the station, where the cold night air greeted him like an old friend. The cool breeze on his face was a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the station, but it did little to ease the tightness in his chest. Louis stepped outside, blinking against the harsh streetlights that illuminated the station's entrance. His heart raced as he realized that this was far from over. This wasn't the kind of situation that would be swept under the rug. As Louis stood there, the reality of the night came crashing down on him all at once. He wasn't just another man who had been wrongfully arrested. He was a judge, a figure of authority in a city still grappling with its racial past. His arrest would make waves, not just in Charleston, but across the country. The media would latch onto this story, spinning it into yet another example of systemic injustice. Another case of a black man being treated as guilty before proving his innocence. And Louis knew that this was exactly what needed to happen. The officer stepped back, leaving Louis alone in the harsh glare of the station's lights. The quiet of the street was punctuated by the distant hum of passing cars and the soft rustle of trees in the night breeze. The city seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable storm that was about to hit. Louis knew that this was a moment that could not be ignored. A moment that would define him, and perhaps the future of the justice system he had worked so hard to believe in. But for now, there was nothing he could do but wait. The consequences of what had happened tonight would ripple out, touching the lives of everyone Louis knew. His colleagues, his family, the community he had served for so long, they would all feel the impact of this night. But that was a battle for tomorrow. Tonight, all Louis could do was stand under the weight of the injustice that had been thrust upon him and prepare for what was to come. For the first time in his life, Louis understood what it felt like to be powerless, to be on the other side of the law, to be seen not as a judge, not as a man of respect, but as a threat. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: things could not stay the same. The system Louis had believed in for so long had revealed its cracks, and now he was faced with a choice. He could let this moment pass, let it become just another story in the long line of injustices that had plagued the country for centuries. Or he could stand up, speak out, and fight for the change he knew was desperately needed. As Louis stood there, bathed in the cold light of the Charleston night, he felt the weight of history pressing down on him. This was no longer just his fight. It was a fight for everyone who had ever been wronged by a system that was supposed to protect them. And Louis knew he had no choice but to take up that fight. Tomorrow, the world would wake up to the news of his arrest, and with it, the harsh reality of a justice system that was anything but just. But tonight, the streets of Charleston remained quiet, the ghosts of its past swirling in the darkness, watching and waiting. As Louis stood under the cold Charleston night, the weight of what had happened settled heavily in his chest. He had no clear direction now, only the certainty that his life would never be the same. The next few hours were a blur, marked by his quiet return home and the aching silence that greeted him inside. Emily had been waiting, pacing the length of their living room, her phone in hand, her eyes wide with worry. When Louis entered, he saw the fear flash across her face, the unspoken question hanging in the air between them. But he couldn't bring himself to explain it yet. How could he? How could he begin to tell her that everything they had built, the life they had carefully constructed, had been upended in a single moment of racial suspicion and injustice? There were no words for it yet, only a gnawing emptiness. Emily watched him with the kind of deep concern only a partner could have. She knew him better than anyone, knew when to give him space and when to press for answers. But tonight, she said nothing. She simply crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him, pulling him close as though that one simple act could shield them both from the storm that was surely coming. In that embrace, Louis found a brief moment of solace, but even that was fleeting. The world outside their door had already shifted, and they both knew it. The quiet hum of the house was pierced by the vibration of Louis's phone. He hesitated, but deep down, he knew this moment couldn't be postponed forever. When he glanced at the screen, the number that appeared was from his colleague, Judge Sarah Davies, a friend who had been by his side through some of the most challenging cases in his career. She would have heard by now, of course. The news of his arrest would have spread through the courthouse like wildfire. But Louis wasn't ready for this conversation. Not yet. Instead, he silenced the phone, turning it face down on the kitchen counter. Emily watched him closely, her arms still around him, but Louis could see the questions in her eyes. She didn't ask them. Not yet. She only nodded, knowing that when the time came, they would have to face it together. The following morning, the storm hit in full force. It started with the phone calls. Reporters, colleagues, legal scholars, all wanting to hear from him, all wanting to understand how a judge, a man with such standing, could be subjected to such a public and humiliating arrest. The story had already broken by the time Louis opened his email. News outlets had picked it up overnight, the headlines screaming injustice, racial profiling, and systemic bias. Louis's face was plastered across every local station, accompanied by the footage of his handcuffed arrest. The media had latched onto the story like vultures circling a fresh carcass. The footage was raw, showing Louis standing beside his car, the officer gripping his arm as the cuffs were placed around his wrists. The narrative was already being crafted, with headlines that screamed of racial injustice in Charleston, of how even a black judge wasn't immune to the prejudice ingrained in the system. Louis stared at his computer screen, the words blurring together as he read the endless commentary. His mind couldn't seem to process it all. There was a strange sense of detachment, as though this wasn't his life being dissected by news anchors and legal analysts. They spoke of him as though he were an idea, a symbol of the fractured justice system, rather than a man who had spent his entire career trying to uphold the very law that had turned against him. As the morning wore on, the calls from his colleagues grew more frequent, each one tinged with a mix of concern and confusion. Many of them didn't know what to say. They offered platitudes, assurances that they were on his side, but their words felt hollow, as though they were trying to distance themselves from the controversy while still offering some semblance of support. Louis had no desire to speak to any of them. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, crushing his will to respond. It wasn't until Sarah Davies called again, her third attempt, that Louis finally picked up the phone. Her voice was soft, filled with an understanding that only came from years of working together. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't need to. The whole city knew by now. Instead, she offered her unwavering support. Sarah had always been the kind of colleague who saw the bigger picture, someone who believed in the power of justice even when the system faltered. She told Louis she would be there for whatever he needed, that they would figure this out together. But the truth was, Louis wasn't sure if there was anything left to figure out. His career, his reputation, everything he had worked so hard to build, it all felt fragile now, as though the foundation beneath his feet had been eroded by a single night. The legal system he had believed in was cracking under the pressure of its own weight, and Louis could see now just how deep those cracks ran. The storm outside his door was growing louder. Protesters had gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs demanding justice, calling for police reform, chanting his name as a symbol of the injustice they all faced. Louis watched from a distance, peering out from the safety of his home. He felt an uncomfortable sense of detachment, as though this wasn't his life, but someone else's. The chants echoed in his ears, blending with the distant hum of traffic and the rustling of leaves in the late summer breeze. The protesters had turned him into a symbol, and that terrified him. They weren't chanting for Louis Marshall, the man. They were chanting for what he represented, the fractured system, the deep-rooted racism that plagued Charleston, the injustice that stretched back for generations. Louis had spent his life trying to believe that he could change things from the inside, that the law was a tool for good, a way to protect and serve. But now, standing at the window, watching the crowd below, he wasn't so sure anymore. The anger bubbling in the streets was palpable, and Louis couldn't help but feel a growing sense of fear. He had seen what happened when anger turned into action, when protests became more than just words. The crowd outside was small for now, but it was only a matter of time before the story spread. Before more people gathered, before the calls for justice turned into something bigger, something uncontrollable. The emails continued to flood in, some from friends, offering their support, others from strangers, sharing their own stories of injustice, each one a reminder that this wasn't just about him. This was about something much larger, something systemic. Louis had always known that racism was still alive and well in Charleston, but now he was staring it in the face, feeling its grip on his own life. By the afternoon, the calls from legal organizations and civil rights groups began to come in. They wanted to use his case as a rallying cry, to push for police reform in the city, to highlight the injustice that had occurred. Louis listened to their offers, their plans to fight back, to make his case the cornerstone of a new movement. But even as he listened, his mind felt disconnected. The words, though well-meaning, fell flat against the growing numbness inside him. What had happened to him was part of a larger pattern. He knew that. He had seen it time and time again in his courtroom. Black men and women, caught in the web of systemic racism, fighting to prove their innocence in a world that saw them as guilty first. He had tried to be fair, to bring justice where he could, but now he understood just how broken the system was. Louis knew he couldn't stay silent. The media frenzy, the protests, the calls for reform, they wouldn't let him. But more than that, he couldn't let himself become just another statistic, another example of a black man wronged by the system. He had to speak up, not just for himself, but for the countless others who had been in his shoes, who didn't have the platform or the privilege to fight back. He would have to stand before the cameras, face the crowds, and tell his story. But it wasn't just his story. It was the story of Charleston, of the country, of every man and woman who had been silenced by a system that was supposed to protect them. And Louis would have to bear that weight, even if it crushed him in the process. In the quiet hours of the afternoon, as the sun began to sink lower in the sky, Louis knew that his life had changed forever. The streets of Charleston were no longer the same, and neither was he. The fight ahead would be long, and there were no guarantees of victory. But Louis knew one thing for certain: he couldn't walk away from this. Not now. Not ever. The world was watching. The next morning, Louis woke to the sound of his phone buzzing incessantly on the nightstand. He had barely slept, his mind consumed by the whirlwind of events from the day before. The media, the calls, the protests, it all felt like a surreal nightmare he couldn't wake from. He reached for the phone, his hand heavy with exhaustion, and stared at the screen. His inbox was flooded with messages. Reporters, legal organizations, even distant acquaintances from law school, all clamoring for his attention. Each notification was a reminder that his life, once private and orderly, had been thrust into the public eye with brutal force. Louis's gaze shifted toward the window, where the morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting thin rays of light across the room. The protesters from the night before had grown in number, and now they lined the street outside his home. Their signs held high, their voices carrying the steady rhythm of anger and defiance. He could hear their chants echoing faintly through the walls, mixing with the hum of the city as it awoke to another day. It wasn't just a protest anymore. It was a movement. Emily stood in the doorway of their bedroom, watching him quietly. She hadn't said much since the incident, choosing instead to support him with silent, unwavering strength. But Louis knew that inside, she was battling her own storm of emotions. They had built a life together, a family, and now everything seemed to be unraveling before their eyes. She crossed the room and sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm. The touch was warm, grounding him in the present, but even that comfort couldn't dispel the weight pressing down on him. She handed him a newspaper. The headline blared in bold black letters: "Charleston Judge Arrested, a Symbol of Systemic Racism?" Below it was a picture of Louis, taken from the footage of his arrest. His face illuminated by the harsh glow of police lights, his expression a mix of shock and disbelief. The image was stark, a brutal reminder of how easily the system could turn against even those sworn to uphold it. Louis felt a bitter taste rise in his throat as he stared at the headline. He had spent years avoiding the spotlight, preferring to work quietly within the confines of the courtroom, where justice was supposed to be blind. But now, his face was plastered across newspapers, websites, and social media, his name invoked in conversations about racial profiling and systemic bias. He had become a symbol, whether he wanted to be or not. "Are you ready?" Emily's voice was soft, but there was an underlying firmness to it. She knew what had to be done, even if Louis wasn't sure he was prepared for it. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood and moved to the window, pushing aside the curtains just enough to see the gathering crowd below. The protest had grown overnight, fueled by anger and frustration that went far beyond his personal experience. These people weren't just there for him. They were there for themselves, for their families, for their community. They were demanding justice, not just for Louis Marshall, but for every black man and woman who had been wronged by the system. The sight was both overwhelming and empowering. Louis felt a mixture of emotions: gratitude for their support, fear for what might happen next, and a gnawing sense of responsibility that weighed heavily on his conscience. He had to face them, to stand before the crowd and the cameras and say something meaningful. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the broader fight for equality and justice, about dismantling the very system he had once believed in. Emily stood beside him, her presence steady and comforting. Louis turned to her, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," he admitted quietly, the vulnerability in his voice undeniable. She met his gaze, her expression soft but resolute. "You don't have a choice anymore, Louis. They're waiting for you. They need you." She was right. The crowd outside wasn't going to dissipate. The media wasn't going to move on. This moment was here, and it was his responsibility to step into it. The world was watching, and he couldn't afford to stay silent. By late morning, Louis had dressed in a simple suit, the familiar weight of his judicial robes notably absent. He had always taken comfort in those robes, in the authority they represented. But today, he would stand before the crowd not as a judge, but as a man. A black man who had been wrongfully arrested, his humanity stripped away by a system that refused to see beyond his skin color. The front steps of his home had become a makeshift stage, the crowd spilling into the street below. Reporters jostled for position, their cameras trained on him as he stepped outside, the blinding flashes capturing every moment, every expression. The protesters had quieted when they saw him emerge, their chants falling into a tense silence as they waited for him to speak. Louis took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment press down on him. His mind raced, searching for the right words, but everything felt inadequate in the face of what had happened. How could he possibly articulate the pain, the fear, the anger that had consumed him since that night? How could he put into words the deep-seated injustice that stretched back centuries, an injustice that he, too, had become a victim of? He scanned the crowd, recognizing some of the faces from his courtroom. People he had sentenced, people whose cases had been dismissed, people who had stood before him, pleading for justice. Now they stood before him again, not as defendants or plaintiffs, but as allies in a fight that went beyond any single case. Louis stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the podium. The microphones were positioned before him, their cold metal surfaces reflecting the sunlight. The cameras continued to roll, their lenses capturing every second of this historic moment. He was keenly aware of the eyes on him, not just from the crowd, but from across the nation. This wasn't just a local story anymore. It was a national conversation about race, power, and justice. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, though it carried the weight of a man who had seen too much, experienced too much. "I stand before you today as both a judge and a black man. And in the eyes of the law, that second part has erased the first." The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. Louis could feel the tension in the air, the anticipation of what he would say next. He took another breath, letting the reality of the moment settle in. "What happened to me is not unique. It's not a one-time event, a mistake to be corrected with a simple apology. It's part of a pattern of systemic racism that has plagued this country for generations. I've spent my career fighting for justice, believing that the law could be fair and just. But I've seen now, more than ever, how that belief can be broken, how the system can fail even those who are supposed to be protected by it." He could see the nods in the crowd, the murmurs of agreement rippling through the sea of faces. This wasn't just about him. It was about every person in that crowd who had been marginalized, silenced, or mistreated by the very system that claimed to serve them. Louis continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "We cannot allow this to continue. We cannot stand by and watch as our brothers and sisters are wrongfully arrested, abused, and mistreated by a system that was never designed to protect us. It's time for real change. Change that goes beyond words, beyond promises. We need action. We need accountability. We need justice. The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers filling the air with a palpable sense of hope and determination. Louis felt the power of their support, the collective energy of a movement that was larger than any one person. It wasn't just about his arrest, it was about the countless others who had been silenced, ignored, and dismissed by the system. It was about changing that system, about making sure that no one else had to experience what he had. As the applause continued, Louis stood there, the weight of his words still hanging in the air. He had stepped into a role he had never anticipated, one that he wasn't sure he was ready for. But now, there was no turning back. The fight for justice had begun, and Louis knew that he had to see it through. The media would continue to dissect his story, the protests would grow, and the calls for reform would become louder. But for the first time since that fateful night, Louis felt a sense of clarity, a sense of purpose. This was about more than just him. It was about all of them. And as he looked out at the sea of faces before him, Louis knew that the fight for justice was only beginning. As the days passed, the protest outside Louis's home evolved from a local outcry into a full-fledged movement. The crowd had swelled, spilling out from the narrow streets of his neighborhood and onto the broader avenues of Charleston, their voices becoming a constant hum in the background of the city. Signs bearing his name were held high, calling for justice, reform, and accountability. But as the movement grew, so did the tension. It was no longer just about what had happened to Louis. His arrest had become a spark, igniting a fire that had been smoldering in the community for years. People of all backgrounds, but especially those from Charleston's black neighborhoods, had poured into the streets, their collective frustration and anger finally boiling over. The city's history, steeped in slavery, segregation, and systemic racism, had been cracked wide open, and the fractures were impossible to ignore. Louis watched the movement unfold from a distance, his heart heavy with a mix of emotions. He had become a reluctant symbol, the face of a fight that was both deeply personal and far larger than himself. Every day, more reporters crowded the streets, and national media had taken up his story as a rallying cry for police reform. His name was now being spoken in homes and on news channels across the country, a name that had once carried respect in the courtroom, but now carried the weight of an entire system's failures. Yet despite the noise outside, inside Louis's home, there was a stillness, a quiet that contrasted sharply with the chaos beyond the walls. Emily had been a constant source of support, her presence steady even as the world around them seemed to spiral out of control. But Louis could see the strain in her eyes. She was worried, not just about him, but about what this fight was doing to their family. Jack and Sophie, too young to fully grasp the complexities of what was happening, had grown quiet, their once lively spirits dampened by the tension that hung in the air. For Louis, the weight of it all was becoming unbearable. He had spent his life believing in the law, in the justice system, and now that belief had been shattered. He had been thrown into a fight that he hadn't asked for, a fight that was consuming every aspect of his life. The courtroom, once a place where he felt in control, now seemed distant, a place he wasn't sure he could return to. Everywhere he turned, there were reminders of what had happened. The footage of his arrest continued to play on loop across television screens, and the public discourse around his case had grown increasingly polarized. Some saw him as a hero, a man who had stood up against systemic injustice. Others saw him as a disruption to the status quo, an inconvenient truth that forced them to confront the ugly reality of racism that still existed in their city. And then there were the messages. Some were words of support from friends, colleagues, and strangers alike, encouraging him to keep fighting, to use his platform to demand change. But others were less kind. The threats, the slurs, the accusations, they had all found their way into his inbox and his voicemail. Stark reminders that there were still many who would rather silence him than see the system exposed for what it was. Late one evening, as the sounds of the protests drifted in through the open window, Louis sat at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of legal documents in front of him. His attorneys had been working around the clock, preparing a case against the Charleston Police Department, and they were confident that they had a strong argument. But Louis couldn't shake the feeling that no matter what happened in the courtroom, the damage had already been done. The documents in front of him blurred as his mind wandered back to that night. The flashing lights, the officer's hand on his holster, the cold bite of the handcuffs. He had replayed the moment over and over in his mind, searching for some way he could have prevented it, some action he could have taken to change the outcome. But no matter how many times he went through it, the result was always the same. He had done nothing wrong, and yet he had been treated as though he were a criminal. That thought gnawed at him, refusing to let go. He had spent his life fighting for justice, believing in the power of the law to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. But now, sitting in his own home, surrounded by legal documents that were supposed to bring him justice, he couldn't help but wonder if the law was capable of protecting anyone at all. Emily entered the kitchen, her footsteps soft as she crossed the room to sit beside him. She didn't say anything at first, just placed her hand on his, offering a quiet support that words couldn't convey. Louis looked at her, the exhaustion evident in his eyes. He hadn't slept well in days, and the emotional toll was starting to show. "You need to rest," she said gently, her voice barely above a whisper. Louis shook his head, his gaze falling back to the papers in front of him. "I can't," he replied, his voice heavy with resignation. "There's too much to do." Emily's hand tightened around his, her grip firm but comforting. "You've been fighting for so long," she said, "but you can't fight this battle alone." Her words hung in the air, and Louis felt the truth of them settle over him like a weight he had been carrying for far too long. He had always believed that he could fix things, that he could make the system work if he just tried hard enough. But now, faced with the reality of his own experience, he wasn't sure if that was true anymore. The protests outside had grown louder, the chants echoing through the quiet night. Louis knew that the people out there were fighting for him, for the justice they believed he deserved. But he also knew that this fight went beyond him. It was a fight for all of them, for every person who had been wrongfully arrested, who had been mistreated by the system, who had been told that their life didn't matter. For the first time since his arrest, Louis felt the weight of that responsibility in a way that went beyond his own personal suffering. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for something bigger, something far more important, and that terrified him. The following morning, Louis found himself standing outside the courthouse, the steps leading up to the grand, imposing building feeling steeper than ever before. The courthouse had always been a place of power for him, a place where he could bring order to chaos, where justice could be served. But now, as he stood at the foot of those steps, he felt a sense of dread creeping over him. Today would be his first day back in the courtroom since his arrest. The media was already gathered, their cameras and microphones poised, ready to capture his every move. The protesters were there too, their signs and banners waving in the air, their voices chanting his name as they called for justice. Louis took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He had always been confident in the courtroom, always sure of his place behind the bench. But today that confidence felt distant, replaced by a gnawing uncertainty that he couldn't shake. As he ascended the steps, the weight of the past few weeks pressed down on him. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, watching, waiting. His hands trembled slightly, but he kept his head held high, refusing to let the fear show. He had no choice but to face this head-on. Inside, the courtroom was quiet, the usual hum of activity muted by the tension in the air. Louis made his way to the bench, the familiar seat of authority feeling foreign under him. He looked out at the faces in the gallery, reporters, legal experts, citizens, all waiting to see how this moment would unfold. He had always believed that the courtroom was a place where truth prevailed, where justice was blind. But now, sitting here, he wasn't so sure. The system had failed him, and now he was tasked with upholding that very system, knowing full well the deep flaws that lay beneath its surface. The gavel felt heavy in his hand as he brought it down to call the court to order. The room fell silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. Lewis knew that today would be different. Today, he wasn't just a judge. He was a man who had been wronged by the very system he was sworn to uphold. As the proceedings began, Lewis listened carefully, his mind sharp despite the emotional exhaustion that clung to him like a shadow. But as the case unfolded before him, he found it difficult to focus. The words of the attorneys, the evidence being presented, it all seemed distant, as though he were watching it through a fog. His thoughts kept drifting back to that night, to the moment when everything had changed. He could still feel the tightness of the handcuffs around his wrists, the cold metal biting into his skin. The courtroom, once a place of clarity and reason, now felt like a battleground, one where justice was anything but certain. The case ended and the courtroom emptied, leaving Louis alone behind the bench. The silence was deafening, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. He sat there for a long time, his hands resting on the wooden surface, his mind racing with thoughts of what had happened and what was still to come. Louis knew that this fight was far from over. The system he had once believed in was broken, and now he was faced with the impossible task of trying to fix it, even as it continued to fail him and those like him. He had no choice but to keep going, to keep fighting. But deep down, he wondered if it would ever be enough. The weight of Louis' return to the courtroom stayed with him, heavy and unshakable, as the days stretched into weeks. Each case, each ruling felt more difficult to deliver, as though the system was mocking him with every motion and verdict. The protests outside the courthouse never ceased, their chants becoming the soundtrack of his life, a constant reminder that change was demanded, not just for him, but for all those who had suffered under the same weight of injustice. Louis sat at his desk late into the night, the soft glow of a desk lamp casting long shadows across his study. The documents before him, a new wave of legal briefs, press statements, and plans for reform, seemed to multiply every time he blinked. His inbox was still filled with messages from civil rights organizations, legal scholars, and activists who wanted to turn his case into a national moment for change. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about Charleston, about the country, about a system that had been exposed for its glaring inequalities. But Louis couldn't escape the deep sense of isolation creeping into his mind. His life had become a series of battles, each one more exhausting than the last. The once clear lines between his personal life, his career, and his role in the growing movement had blurred beyond recognition. He had been fighting for weeks, but now the energy that had once fueled his desire for justice felt as though it was draining away. Emily, ever watchful, noticed the change in him. She would find him sitting at his desk in the dark, his head resting in his hands, as though the weight of the world had finally settled on his shoulders. She had been his anchor through it all, but even her presence couldn't fully pull him from the depths of his despair. He had always been strong, always able to carry the burdens of his position with dignity. But now, everything felt fractured. The movement outside their home had grown larger, louder, more volatile. The peaceful protests had been joined by more radical elements, people who saw his case not just as an opportunity for reform, but as a reason to tear down the entire system. The chance for justice had given way to anger, frustration, and the sharp edge of potential violence. Louis could feel the city teetering on the brink, its history of racial tension reawakened by his arrest, by the growing national attention, by the refusal of the system to change fast enough. One evening, as the noise from the streets below rose to a fever pitch, Louis stood at the window, watching the growing crowd. What had once been a peaceful assembly of citizens demanding change had transformed into something more dangerous. The faces in the crowd were unfamiliar, the anger palpable. Signs with his name still dotted the landscape, but now they were joined by others. Calls for revolution, for dismantling the police, for action that went far beyond legal reform. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. Louis had seen it before, in other cities, in other movements. He knew how quickly things could spiral out of control. He had watched it on the news, presided over cases where similar unrest had led to tragic outcomes. And now, he could feel the same forces gathering outside his own home, pressing in on him from all sides. The media was relentless, hounding him for interviews, for statements. They wanted to know how he felt about the growing unrest, about the calls for more radical action. They wanted to hear him condemn the police, to push for drastic changes that went beyond the slow, methodical pace of legal reform. But Louis couldn't bring himself to do it. He believed in justice, in the law, even after everything that had happened. He knew the system was broken, but he also knew that tearing it down completely would leave chaos in its wake. And yet, every time he hesitated to speak out, every time he failed to meet the demands of the more extreme factions of the movement, he felt himself slipping further away from the people who had once supported him. The protesters still chanted his name, but now their eyes were filled with impatience, with frustration that he wasn't leading them toward the revolution they so desperately wanted. One night, as the protests reached a boiling point, Louis sat alone in his study, staring at the blank pages of a speech he had been asked to give at a rally the next day. The pressure to say something profound, something that would galvanize the movement, weighed heavily on him. But no matter how hard he tried, the words wouldn't come. His mind was clouded with doubt, his heart heavy with the realization that no speech, no rally could fix what was broken. The sound of glass shattering pulled him from his thoughts. Louis jumped to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest as he rushed to the window. Below, the once peaceful protest had turned into a chaotic scene. A group of people, their faces obscured by masks and bandanas, had smashed the windows of a nearby storefront, and the crowd was surging forward, caught up in the sudden burst of violence. The police had arrived, their flashing lights casting an eerie glow over the street as they moved in to contain the chaos. Louis' breath caught in his throat as he watched the scene unfold. This wasn't what he had wanted. This wasn't the change he had hoped to inspire. The peaceful calls for justice had been drowned out by the roar of anger and frustration, by the destructive energy that had been unleashed in the wake of his arrest. The city was unraveling, and Louis felt powerless to stop it. Emily appeared beside him, her face pale as she took in the scene below. She didn't say anything, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. For weeks they had watched the protests from a distance, feeling a sense of solidarity with the people who had come to support Louis and demand change. But now, that solidarity had been replaced by fear, fear of what was happening in their city, fear of what might happen next. Louis stepped back from the window, his hands trembling. He had fought for justice his entire life, but now that fight felt distant, out of reach. The movement he had hoped to lead had spiraled beyond his control, and the very people who had once supported him were now demanding something he wasn't sure he could give. They wanted action, immediate and uncompromising. But Louis knew that real change, the kind that lasted, couldn't come from chaos. He sank into his chair, his mind spinning as the sounds of the unrest outside grew louder. The ideals he had held on to for so long, justice, fairness, the rule of law, felt fragile now, like relics of a system that had already failed too many people. He had believed in the power of the law to bring about change, but now he wasn't sure if that belief could withstand the reality of what was happening around him. The phone on his desk buzzed again, another call from the media, another request for a statement. Louis ignored it, his hands resting on the blank pages of his unfinished speech. He didn't have the words. He didn't have the answers. All he had was the growing sense that the world was moving on without him, that the fight he had dedicated his life to was slipping further and further out of his control. The next morning, the news was filled with images of the unrest. Broken windows, fires burning in the streets, protesters clashing with police. The headlines were no longer about Louis' arrest or the peaceful calls for reform. Now, they were about the violence that had erupted in Charleston, the city's long history of racial tension finally boiling over into chaos. And in the middle of it all, Louis' name was still being invoked, still being used as a symbol of the injustice that had sparked the unrest. But as he sat at his desk staring at the news reports, Louis felt nothing but exhaustion. The fight for justice had become something else, something darker and more dangerous. The calls for reform had been drowned out by the sounds of breaking glass and angry chants, and the movement that had once filled him with hope now felt like a burden he could no longer carry. Emily found him later that evening, still sitting at his desk, the blank pages of his speech untouched. She didn't ask if he was all right. She didn't need to. She knew that the weight of everything was crushing him, that the man who had once stood so tall was now struggling to hold on. "I don't know what to do," Louis admitted quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily sat beside him, her hand resting on his. "You've done everything you can," she said gently, "but you can't fix this alone." Louis knew she was right. He couldn't fix it alone, but the thought of letting go, of stepping back from the fight, felt like failure. He had spent his life believing that he could make a difference, that he could change the system from within. But now, as the city burned and the movement raged on without him, he wasn't sure if that was true anymore. The world had changed, and Louis wasn't sure if he could change with it.